Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Some stories creep into your mind. Others claw their way in and refuse to leave. Bryan Asbury's Waking the Dead is here. 8 bone-chilling tales of terror and retribution brought to life by the production team behind Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and the voices of Otis, Jiry, Drew Blood, and Geoff Sturtevant. Revenge, violence, a dark humor that cuts deep. From a quadriplegic's horrifying payback to a mother's gruesome fate, Asbury holds nothing back. This is horror that stays with you. Waking the Dead, available now on Amazon and Audible. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and press play.
Welcome, dear listener, to Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. Set aside some moments now and take an adventurous ride on a journey into the psyche of some talented writers. They will dig into your being and titillate you. Oh, I love that word, titillate. While the stories may not all take place in the Heartland, I am delivering them to you from the Heartland. My intention is to strike fear and confusion into the mind, soul, and yes, the heart. This is Fear from the Heartland. Hello, Heartlanders, and welcome to Season 6, Episode 3 of Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. This is so stupid, and that's why I love it. What's an ant's favorite sport? Cricket? What do you call an ant who likes to be alone? Independent? What do you call an ant who joins the army? Militant? Where do ants go on vacation? France? Or Antigua? What do you call an ant who can't speak? A mutant? What do you call a well-dressed ant? Elegant? What do you call a luxurious ant? Decadent? Why was the baby ant confused? Because all his uncles were ants. Now I'm confused. I'll let Bryan Asbury set us straight in tonight's story. Let's get after it. Hank has taken on the enemy and come out on top, as evidenced in his deployment decades ago in Vietnam. He's never had to go up against a thorax-bodied, 6-legged, razor-mandible-stinging, uranium-infused ant before. Well, in fairness, there are thousands of them. Maybe millions? No matter. He feels he's up to the task. These little bastards are no match for Hank Fraser. Right? Without further ado, dear listener, I present to you The War by Bryan Asbury. Hank Fraser was a 74-year-old retired Vietnam veteran who had always taken pride in his yard. It had even graced the main page of the landscaping company's website that did work for him the previous summer. Gardening for him was therapeutic and an effective way for him to cope with the mental and physical scars that he carried with him from the war. If he learned one thing from his time in the service, it was the importance of doing a job right. His elderly neighbor Mary drove by in her Ford minivan and honked. He looked up and waved as he pruned his roses. He then took the opportunity to adjust his glasses, which had begun to slide down his nose from the sweat that formed on his brow. Kenny Rogers could be heard playing on the stereo in his garage. "Honey, don't overdo it out there. There's a high heat warning in effect," his wife Rebecca hollered from the screen door. "I'm almost done." "That's what you said a half hour ago, and a half hour before that." He turned away from looking at the climbing roses that scaled the side of his wooden pergola and began collecting his gardening tools. His newly planted lilac bush was watered and given its follow-up dose of fertilizer. The grass had been cut earlier in the morning. Hank made sure to alternate directions so as to encourage a straighter growth pattern. The pine trees were showing signs of stress, but it was to be expected considering the unusual spring heat wave that Pueblo was in the midst of. All in all, it was a good day, and Hank felt a sense of purpose that made life worth living. Hank wiped his forehead with a napkin as he sat under their covered patio enjoying a tall glass of iced tea. His body suddenly jerked as he swatted his arm. When he pulled his hand away, a shriveled ant carcass was left tangled in his sweaty gray arm hair. He curiously examined it, then used his pointer finger to flick it off him. He picked the newspaper up off the table. The article on the front page read, "General Motors to shift more jobs overseas." He shook his head in disgust. "Might as well just sign away this whole damn country to the Chinese," he muttered to himself. "Beth called. She's dropping the kids off with us tonight," his wife hollered from inside the house. "Of course she is. She's got more important things to do than watch her kids," he mumbled under his breath. "Hank, don't be a grump." He lowered his newspaper and huffed. Rebecca had a knack for overhearing his snide comments. "Is she by chance still dating that one biker guy?" he asked. "His name's Rondo, and yes, at least as far as I know." Hank rolled his eyes and buried his head back in his paper. That evening, the sound of Rondo's cherry bombs on his Chevy pickup caused Hank to part the blinds as he pulled up into his driveway. Hank made his way outside as his grandchildren raucously spilled out from the truck's back seat. "Grandpa!" they shouted spiritedly as they held their backpacks and sprinted across the yard. "Use the sidewalk, not the grass!" he exclaimed as he waved his arms in the air. He bent over and hugged them, then scooped up his granddaughter Jasmine in his arms. "You gonna color a picture for Grandpa?" he said with a beaming smile. She smiled and nodded. He sat her back down and glanced over at Rondo, who waved from inside the truck's cab. "Thanks, we'll be back for him on Sunday." The hearty smile left Hank's face as he barely acknowledged him. He then turned and escorted his grandchildren inside the house. They dropped their backpacks onto the ground next to the front door and scurried towards Rebecca, who was sitting on the couch. They jumped on top of her, which sent their chihuahua, Gizmo, fleeing out of the room. "How's Grandma's little minions doing? Did you behave yourselves this week?" Trent looked up, then smiled mischievously and shook his head. Rebecca playfully huffed. "Well, you better be." As Hank walked into the living room, Rebecca looked over at him. "Did you tell Rondo hi?" Hank sighed. "I'll tell him hi when he'll shake like a man, not that stupid slapping hands shit." Rebecca frowned. "You have to make an attempt, too. Bethy finally managed to meet someone who seems halfway stable. Just give him a chance, okay?" A little while later, Hank brushed his mustache, then adjusted his war veteran's cap in front of the bathroom mirror. Tonight was his monthly VFW meeting, and it was a special occasion. Retired professional wrestler, politician, and Vietnam veteran Jiry West was making a special guest appearance at their post, so turnout was expected to be robust. Hank sat behind the wheel of his Buick, stranded in traffic which was gridlocked outside of the VFW. When he finally managed to find a parking spot and make it into the building, the meeting had already commenced. He weaved through the maze of tables and found a seat next to his buddies, Kenny and Merle. He sat down and sighed. "Did you guys have a hard time finding a parking spot?" Kenny chuckled. "Hell, Merle had to park next to the Starlight Motel. I told him after the meeting if he's lucky, maybe he'll get a happy ending by one of the girls working the corner down there." Kenny laughed obnoxiously as he rested his hands on his bloated gut. Did you hear about the deaf gynecologist who moved into the building across the street? Apparently, he's also a lip reader. Hank shook his head, unamused. You've only told that one like 10 times now. Anyway, this guy better be worth it after fighting that fucking traffic. Hank removed his cap and wiped the sweat from his forehead. That shit triggers my PTSD. The presiding officer soon ambled over to the podium and picked up the mic. Hello, all my military brothers and sisters. I'm happy that you could all be in attendance tonight. I hope finding parking wasn't too much of a chore. Hank huffed and crossed his arms. Well, I won't bore you too much longer up here. Tonight we want to welcome a special guest speaker. Many of you may well recognize him from his wrestling career or maybe his term as the governor of our great state. So, without further ado, I'll turn the stage over to retired professional wrestler, politician, and fellow veteran, Mr. Jiry West. The crowd applauded and the auditorium darkened as God Bless the USA by Lee Greenwood began blaring through the overhead speakers. A low-budget red, white, and blue light show then acted to set the stage for Jiry West, who was sitting at a table near the presiding officer. Jiry rose to his feet, then turned and fist-pumped the audience. He then feebly made his way up to the podium. He took the mic, then shook the presiding officer's hand. A few moments later, the light show turned off, and the music ceased as the auditorium brightened back up. Jiry smiled widely as the light shined through his thinning white hair. From a distance, it looked like he was wearing extensions that were made out of silly string. Hello, brothers and sisters in arms. That warm welcome was almost as exciting for me as when I military pressed Lord Gigantus over my head at WrestleMania 1. He looked around at the audience. But here's the thing. We as military veterans face even bigger challenges than I did that night at the Gardens. His voice bellowed as if he was cutting a promo. Cuts from our opponents on Capitol Hill threaten to weaken our pensions. Tapped his index finger on the podium to reinforce his point. Pensions that were earned through the sacrifices that we so selflessly made. You combine that with the growing threat from China, and it makes for a tag team dynasty that would give even the Legion of Doom a run for their money. Hank's ears perked up when he heard the word China. He turned to Kenny and Merle. I kind of like what this guy has to say. The next day, Hank woke up before sunrise. He loved the stillness and solitude of the early mornings. The air was cool and crisp, and the plants glistened with the sheen of fresh dew. He peacefully strolled through his backyard while smoking a cigarette. Perched atop his blue spruce was a bird's nest. He stopped in front of it and smiled to himself as he watched the mother bird feeding her young. As he continued through his yard, his eyes were suddenly drawn to an unsightly ant pile that marred the landscape. He walked over to it and frowned as he took a drag off his smoke. It appeared deserted, but more than likely the inhabitants were sheltering underground. He kicked the pile, which sent some of the sand and pebbles flying into the air. A few minutes later, he rummaged through his garage as he searched for his ant killer. He dug through his endless supply of fertilizer and pesticides before finally coming across Terminator ant bait. Hank returned to the ant pile several moments later and began spreading the pellets around its outer perimeter as the directions advised. The next day, he repeated his morning ritual. He sparked up a cigarette and moseyed out his front door. To his surprise, when he stepped into his backyard, the ant pile had nearly doubled in size. It protruded from the earth like a pitcher's mound. He stared at it with a baffled look on his face. The worker ants were active now, scurrying around as they carried out their duties. Their appearance was different than any other ant that Hank had ever remembered seeing before. They were nearly double the size of a carpenter ant and irregular in shape. Some staggered to the side as they marched, while others had deformed heads and grossly overgrown mandibles, and they seemed to have an intelligence about themselves. He noticed that many of them ceased what they were doing and turned as if they noticed him. It was kind of strange and uncharacteristic of typical insect behavior. He took one last drag off his cigarette, then leaned down and blew the smoke towards the mound. The ants backed away cautiously, then seemed to begin communicating amongst themselves. Hank sighed, then flicked his cigarette butt onto their pile as he turned and walked away. That evening, he accompanied Merle to his Tuesday night AA meeting. Merle had struggled with alcoholism since returning from the war. He invited Hank to come as a guest since tonight was an open meeting. The members sat around in a circle and soon began introducing themselves. The first person to speak was an older, angry-looking Hispanic man with a gray handlebar mustache who sat slouched in his chair. "I'm Southside Larry, the real alcoholic. I'm here by the grace of God and also my probation officer." "Thank you, Larry," the members all chanted. The next man up motioned to the room. "I'm Tim. I'll be chairing tonight's meeting, and I'm also an alcoholic. I see many familiar faces tonight, and also some new ones. For those of you who don't know me, I started drinking before some of you in here were even born." He looked around the room. "I used to think it was fun, and it helped me to loosen up." He grinned leisurely. "Who doesn't like to have fun, right?" The grin then suddenly wiped off his face. He reached down and removed his prosthetic leg, then slammed it on the table. "Well, this is what fun eventually got me," he exclaimed. After Merle spoke, the room then shifted their eyes toward Hank. He sat up and looked around tepidly as if he were caught off guard. Am I supposed to speak?" he said with his arms crossed. Tim nodded. "Go ahead, brother. We're all family in here." "Well, my name's Hank, and I'm just here to support my friend Merle. We both served in Vietnam together." "Thank you, Hank," the room then chanted. Tim looked over at Hank. His prosthetic leg still rested on the table next to him. "First off, thank you both for your service. Have you yourself ever struggled with alcohol abuse as a result of the war?" Hank frowned and began shaking his head. "No, I have a drink every now and then." He could feel the eyes on him. "But it's never been a problem." Tim stared at him skeptically. "Well, I just hope you're being completely honest with yourself." After Hank returned home that night, he plopped down on the couch and turned on the evening news. He peeled off his socks as pieces of lint filled the crevices in between his toes. Gizmo jumped up on the couch and began licking his feet. "That's right, Gizmo. Clean 'em up," Hank said as he outstretched his arms and placed them behind his head. Rebecca walked into the room and sat down next to him. "Gizmo!" she exclaimed. The dog stopped what he was doing, then cocked his head to the side and let out a disappointed whimper. "What? I was getting a foot bath," Hank joked. "That's gross." In local news, Pueblo and surrounding areas are under siege this spring by an influx of destructive and potentially lethal invaders, a reporter on the TV said. The news broadcast then showed a video of ants foraging for food. Mutated Iranian army ants, also known by villagers as shaitan or little red demons, are just one of the many frightening byproducts of increased uranium enrichment by Iran, and now scientists warn that they've made their way into the U.S. Hank sat up at attention as the grin left his face. The video then switched to a head of cattle that grazed in a pasture. Marty Dunsmore, a rancher whose family set up a homestead in Colorado more than 150 years ago, recalls his horrific encounter with the ravenous insects. "Well, in this industry, we've always had to deal with adversity. In the 70s and 80s, it was cattle mutilations. There were times when we'd venture out to check on the herd, and it wasn't uncommon to discover 2 or 3 who were targeted." "By targeted, what do you mean by that?" the reporter asked. The camera zoomed in on the rancher's face. He was a tall, gray-haired man with a wiry mustache. He wore a tan cowboy hat and was dressed in faded blue jeans and a blue denim shirt. He sighed. "Well, pardon my French, but they seem to have a fascination with a certain part of the animal's anatomy. They'd be slumped over, lying stone-cold dead with their assholes removed with surgical precision. Not a drop of blood anywhere." He paused briefly as he recollected. "It was actually quite impressive. Then last year, the government reintroduced the gray wolf, which naturally forced us to up our protection efforts." "So, How is this predator different from the rest of those threats? The rancher stared bleakly into the camera. We've taken a huge hit. I've probably lost at least 50 or more cows in this last month. The way they stripped the carcass down. He turned away as he fought to maintain his composure, then turned back. The swiftness and the way they stripped those animals down to bare bones almost made the cattle mutilations seem like an act of compassion. I'm sorry to hear that. I can obviously tell that this is a difficult subject for you to discuss. What would your advice be for other Pueblo residents who may be dealing with these insects? Be prepared for death. If they can take out an 1,100-pound animal like that, just imagine what they can do to a pet. Or worse yet, a child. Thank you, Marty. The reporter then shook his head grimly. Very disturbing stuff. Now, we've been told that the city will be conducting abatement spraying to help mitigate the spread of these deadly insects. Health officials are strongly encouraging residents to avoid outdoor activities such as gardening, which can greatly increase your chances of being bit or stung. And if you believe that you've stumbled upon a nest, you should leave it undisturbed and immediately contact your local health department. Michael McNally, News 13. Oh my God! Rebecca exclaimed as she turned to Hank and placed her hand over her mouth. She then pointed. What if that big ant pile in the back are the ones they're talking about? She said with alarm. Listen, Hank said calmly as he motioned with his hand. I fought in the jungles of South Vietnam. You should have seen the bugs over there. Just relax, and tomorrow I'll head over to the hardware store and get some stronger bug killer, okay? Rebecca nodded. I just worry because the grandkids are always back there. Well, we'll just keep them inside for a while. He frowned and shook his head. The media always blows things out of proportion so you'll lock yourself inside your home and they can control you. The next morning, Hank strolled through the aisles of Sonny's Hardware. He approached the young man working the cash register and sat 2 different bottles of ant killer down onto the counter. Hey, Brandon, which one of these do you think works better? Brandon looked over the bottles and tapped on the one labeled Siege. This one, he replied confidently. This contains a healthy dose of borax, which is highly toxic to ants. Hank smiled. Perfect. You dealing with the bug problem? Brandon asked as he rung Hank up. Yeah, he grinned awkwardly. My wife thinks maybe it's the mutated ants they mentioned on the news last night. His demeanor then became more serious. Anyone else mention anything about that? Mutant ants? Hank nodded. Yeah, the story said Iran was enriching uranium, go figure, and the radiation affected some of the insects. Now somehow, all of a sudden, they're over here. Hank grinned skeptically. Sounds a lot like COVID now, doesn't it? He then lowered his voice and leaned in. But either way, you and I both know how those people are. They're not starting wars, they're mutating the damn insects. Well, mutant ants are a new one for me, Brandon chuckled. When Hank returned home, he stepped inside his house to change clothes. The song Short Shorts could be heard blaring from down the hall. As he passed the living room, Rebecca wore her headband and was now dressed in a frumpy yoga outfit as she exercised to Richard Simmons' Sweatin' to the Oldies. I gotta run to the grocery store after I finish up here. Do you need anything besides some steaks for the barbecue? She called out to him. No. He then thought about it for a minute. Yes, Metamucil, he shouted back. After he finished strapping on his suspenders, he made his way into the garage and examined the bottle of ant killer. The front cover was a depiction of ants in the midst of a giant target. The caption on the back read, When it comes to protecting your home from unwanted ants, Siege takes no prisoners. Within 60 minutes, its concentrated formula goes to work killing the queen and destroying the colony. For best results, spray the entire mound until it is thoroughly saturated. Hank opened his back gate and proceeded past the juniper bushes that huddled together next to the side of his house. When he stepped into his backyard, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. To his shock, another mound had formed a few yards away from the first one. The ants were occupying territory and setting up bases as they gradually advanced toward his house. "All right, you little fuck faces, I got your number," he said to himself as he marched towards them angrily. He pointed his nozzle at the mounds and began dousing them in insecticide. The ants began scurrying around in a frenzy, but managed to quickly regroup. Some retreated, while others launched fierce attacks, working together to swarm Hank. He managed to take out a good 10 or 12 as he stomped on them with his Velcro-strapped tennis shoes. The others watched from different locations throughout the yard as the bodies of their fellow comrades were savagely smashed into a pile of mangled remains. "Take that, you sons of bitches!" Hank exclaimed as he backed away. He glanced down at his watch. It was 11:30 a.m. Just after 2 o'clock, he returned to check and see if the colony had begun to succumb to the poison. Both mounds now appeared inactive, as there were no signs of the ants anywhere. They could have retreated as they began to perish, or, more ominously, taken refuge within their nest chambers as they coordinated a counterattack. That evening, as dusk began to descend, Kenny and Merle sat out on Hank's front porch as he grilled some steaks on his Charmaster. Kenny was drinking Keystone and getting loud. Him and Merle had been arguing politics for well over 15 minutes now. "That Democrat mayor is the reason Sportsman's Ammo went out of business," he said as he threw his arm in the air. "All he wants to do is take our guns. And Dale said he thinks he's been bussing in illegals like on the news." Merle frowned. "How the hell would Dale know? What'd he do? Stop and ask if they had a green card?" Kenny took a swig of beer and slammed his can down on the table. "Well, I guess I'm just some dumb redneck, right?" Hank finally walked over and interjected as he tried to keep the peace. "You are a dumb redneck, but who gives a rat's ass? Christ, you two are giving me a damn headache." Kenny's wife Darla looked over at him as she petted their poodle. "Hon, you're scaring Tinkerbell. You know she gets anxiety." Their dog, whose leash was tied to the table, looked up and whimpered as she cowered on the ground. Flames shot up into the air as Hank lifted the lid on his barbecue grill. He then checked the temperature of the steaks with his Denver Broncos thermometer. He smiled widely. "I think your problem is you're just hungry, Kenny." He then put his thermometer down and grabbed a plate and a pair of tongs. "I got a solution for that." As they ate, Darla looked over at Kenny. "Kenny's doctor actually recommended that he cut back on the red meat because his triglycerides were too high." Kenny wiped the grease from his mouth and got a shit-eating grin on his face. "I told him I'd meet him halfway. I said I'd turn vegan after 10 p.m. Suddenly, the table jerked, which tipped over some of the drinks. Tinkerbell broke free of her leash and bolted after a rabbit she spotted in the yard. "Some bitch!" Kenny shouted as his steak dinner was dumped into his lap. "Tinkerbell!" Darla shrieked. The dog quickly disappeared into Hank's backyard. "She has a pollen allergy!" Darla cried out as she quickly rose to her feet and gazed across the yard. Kenny scooted his chair out from underneath him and threw his napkin down as he sighed. "I'll get her," he barked as he took off after her. "Fucking mutt," he hissed under his breath. "Watch the ant piles back there," Hank shouted, but Kenny was already out of earshot. "I'll go around the side in case she runs out into the street." Kenny stumbled into the backyard, impaired by the darkness and the alcohol in his bloodstream. He tried to shield himself as the juniper bushes whipped him in the face with their branches. "Tinkerbell!" he shouted as he looked around. "Tinkerbell, get your ass over here!" An owl called out from atop the oak tree. Kenny turned his head to look, startled by the noise. He finally thought to pull his cell phone from his pants pocket and turn on the light. He proceeded a few more steps before tripping over a garden gnome and falling into what felt like a sand pile. His phone flew out of his hand. "Damn it! Fuck!" he shouted. He grimaced and grabbed his ankle, which he had twisted on the way down. He reached for his phone and shined its light onto the ground in front of him. To his surprise, when the terrain was illuminated, he discovered that Hank's once impressive landscape had been destroyed by several large ant mounds. "Hank!" he cried out. He struggled to get to his feet when he suddenly felt the creeping sensation of insects crawling up his legs. He scrambled around on the ground in frenzy while wildly swatting at his body. Then, he began to feel their fury. The ants wasted no time and began biting and stinging with an unnatural aggression. Kenny cried out helplessly as his pleas rang through the backyard like a lamb that was being slaughtered. The sadistic little creatures, who were more mutant than ant, aimed for the more delicate areas, targeting his thighs, buttocks, and genitals. Their stings felt like gunshots as they repeatedly injected their venom into his pink, doughy flesh. Darla and Rebecca sprinted into view, alerted by his cries for help. "Oh my God, Kenny!" Darla screamed. Hank tore around the corner, carrying Tinkerbell in his arms. He threw down the dog, then ran and grabbed the hose. "Hold on, buddy!" he exclaimed. He sprayed Kenny down, then pulled him to his feet, draping his arm over his shoulder as he helped him hobble to safety. "What happened, hon? Did you get bit?" Darla exclaimed. Kenny screamed, then slid his hand down his pants to check if his penis was still attached. He began hyperventilating. "These things are murderers!" "Let's get you inside," Hank said as he slid open the patio door. Kenny limped inside and collapsed onto the couch, soaking wet. "How bad did they get you?" Hank asked. Kenny's hands quivered as he unbuttoned his pants and pulled them down around his ankles. Giant red welts had begun to form on his legs. He then reluctantly pulled open the waistband on his boxers and peered inside with horror. "Oh, God. Oh, my God, Hank. I think I know you. I think I need to go to the ER." Rebecca stormed out of the room. "All right, I'll pull the car up." Turned to Darla. "Do you want to come along?" She nodded distraughtly. Rebecca came back into the room holding 2 Benadryl tablets and a glass of water. "Here, take these," she said as she handed them to Kenny. She then turned to Darla and took Tinkerbell out of her hands. "I'll watch her while you guys go." "Thank you," Darla said as her eyes welled up with tears. A few hours after Kenny was admitted, the doctor walked into his room as he looked over his chart. He looked down at him and chuckled. "What'd you do to piss off those ants?" Kenny sighed. "I tripped and landed on their pile." "Vicious little critters. That's actually the most bites I've ever seen a person sustain. Anyway, your friend's wife's quick thinking may have saved your life. Unfortunately, though, I don't know if we're out of the woods yet. You most likely have a sprained ankle, and it's not looking good for your hand or scrotum." He pulled open Kenny's gown and winced as he gazed at his groin. "We're going to get you hooked up to an antibiotic drip, which will hopefully provide some damage control." Kenny grimaced and grabbed the doctor by his wrist. "Damage control? What's that supposed to mean?" Doctor sighed and patted Kenny on his hand. "Just hang in there. We'll get you better in no time." "I'm calling the health department today," Rebecca said to Hank as they sat in the kitchen sipping on coffee together the next morning. "I said I'll handle it." She frowned and threw her arm in the air. "Hank, we can't even go into our backyard. Kenny nearly died yesterday. Now, you're the man of the house and I love you, but this is getting out of hand, and I think it requires an expert." Hank nursed his coffee, stone-faced and staring off into space. He took an oath in the military, an oath to protect and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's who he was, and it's how he lived his life, and he wasn't about to break that solemn commitment. "We'll see about that," Hank uttered. Later that day, he stopped at the hospital to visit Kenny. When he walked into his room, he received a less than warm reception. "Hey, buddy, how you holding up?" "Well, I guess if I was into bondage and enjoyed having a tube shoved up my dick hole, I'd say not too bad. That and the TV's been stuck on the Hallmark channel for the last 2 hours because the hand that I have function of can't reach the remote." Hank lowered his head. "Jesus, pal. Here. grabbed the remote and put on the TV show Swamp People. One of the characters, a toothless man wearing a baseball cap, whispered to the camera as he crept closer to the edge of the swamp. "Now, there's a bunch of alligators, leeches, and brain-eating bacteria all within these parts, but I've been doing this since I was knee-high to a spotted skunk." He then clumsily stumbled into the water and began getting viciously attacked by several large alligators. Beeping sounds could be heard as the rest of the cast began cursing and rushing in after him. Kenny sighed. "Can you just turn the TV off?" He then painfully adjusted his groin as he tried to get comfortable. Hank nodded and turned off the TV, then looked down at his friend. "I'm sorry about what happened yesterday." "Sorry? Why didn't you warn me that you were keeping a damn ant farm in your backyard?" Hank sighed. "I've been trying like hell to get rid of them, and I yelled at you, but you must not have heard me." Kenny looked away and shook his head. Hank grabbed the rails on his bed. "Listen, I got your 6. I always have. We're brothers." Kenny began to break down. "They said they may have to amputate my scrotum and 2 of my fingers." He sniffled as he fought back the tears. "How am I going to tell Darla?" Hank frowned. "Like castration? Don't even use that word." Hank hung his head dismally. "Oh, God." He then looked back up and sighed. "Well, if it helps, me and Rebecca really have sex anymore. In fact, the older I get, the more I look at my dick as just something I use to empty my bladder with. Hell, they might as well just take mine, too. It would have probably saved me a lot of stress through the years." "Just stop. That's not helping." "Sorry." Hank then got a look of determination in his eye. "Those bastards want a war? That's what they'll get. They're gonna pay for this." That night, Hank had a terrible nightmare. In his dream, he woke up in the morning and began changing into his clothes. He petted Gizmo in the kitchen and began making coffee as he normally did. He grabbed his cigarettes and removed one from the pack, casually placing it in his mouth. He opened the front door to go outside when he suddenly froze in horror. His eyes got big and his mouth hung open, causing his cigarette to drop onto the ground. Millions of ants blanketed his house. They poured in from all directions, scaling his bistro set and covering every inch of his porch. He slammed the door and squirmed, then began stomping on several that managed to make it inside. His body jerked, waking his wife, who lay next to him. She patted him on his arm. Hon, are you all right?" she said groggily. "Are you having another flashback?" Hank gasped as he awoke with his heart pounding. "Are you okay? You were flailing around on the bed." He paused as he wiped the sleep from his eyes. "Yeah, just a bad dream." Later that morning, Hank pulled into the parking lot of the hardware store. He noticed a young man dressed in camo pants who was marching overzealously around the building's perimeter. Hank, who was wearing his veteran's cap, stopped in front of him. "You military?" The man paused and removed his aviator sunglasses, then stood at attention and saluted Hank. "From one first responder to another, thank you for your service," he said with a slight lisp. "As far as my military status, I'm not currently enlisted unless the recruiters start returning my phone calls. Until that time, I have a higher calling which includes defending this establishment from loiterers, shoplifters, and vandals." Hank walked inside and removed his sunglasses. "Hey, Brandon, what's with the security guard outside?" "We were vandalized a few days ago. That and thefts have been up around here lately." He shrugged his shoulders. "He was the cheapest we could find." Hank sighed. "Well, unfortunately, that's the way of the world nowadays. Hey, did you have anything stronger than that ant killer you sold me the other day? That stuff didn't work." Brandon thought about it for a minute and shook his head. "Oh, that stuff usually works pretty well. Could try gas. I mean, it's toxic as hell, but it's worth a shot." "What do? Just pour it down the opening?" "Pretty much. Helps to have a funnel." "Well, I got plenty of those laying around." As Hank left the store, he heard the security guard confronting a bum who was sitting at the curb. "Oh, you're homeless?" The bum nodded. The security guard puffed out his chest. Well, that sounds like a personal problem. Purchase the product or vacate the premises. The bum put his hands in the air peacefully and got up to leave. The security guard grabbed his radio from his duty belt. Situation resolved, he said as he spoke into the mic. Hank stood in his garage peering through the window with his binoculars. He could see the ants marching in formation like a military show of force. They had now seized control of nearly his entire backyard and monitored its borders like a murderous dictatorship. Moments later, he crept around the side of his house, carrying a gas can and funnel in his hands. The rabbits that lived under his shed were forced to shelter in place. The unlucky few that attempted to escape were reduced to nothing more than grim casualties, their carcasses left decimated and decomposing in the afternoon sun. Hank knew that he had to act quickly before the other colonies were alerted. He decided that he would start with the largest pile first, since it seemed to act as the hub. He took off in a sprint, then bent over and stuffed the funnel into its opening. He steadied his hand, then tilted the can, causing the gas to pour out. But the funnel soon tipped over, and the gas began gushing out uncontrollably. Fuck! He left the funnel and scurried over to the next mound, then began dumping gas on it. Suddenly, a searing pain in his calf nearly dropped him to his knees. He was hit. He dropped the gas can and swatted his leg as he stumbled backwards. The ants, using their keen sense of smell, were quickly alerted of the danger and began to launch fierce counterstrikes. Those on the front lines charged Hank, while others parachuted down from plants and trees as they mobilized. The native ants, who were taken as prisoners, were forced into battle, and soon a large army of insects had begun to assemble. Hank fled inside the house, slamming the glass door shut behind him. Rebecca looked up from the TV. "Are you all right?" "I'm hit. It was a kamikaze attack." Rebecca frowned as she got up out of her seat. "I told you not to go back there." "Well, I did, okay? I'm just not going to sit back and let our yard get destroyed." Hank sat down in the kitchen and rolled up his pant leg. Rebecca bent down and examined his sting. She could feel the warmth that it gave off as she pressed her hand against it. As the hours passed, it continued to swell and stiffen. The sting, which had started off as a small pimple-like mark, had now grown to the size of a $50. The ibuprofen that Hank took barely had any effect, and the pain eventually became all-consuming. "Rebecca, I think I need to have this looked at," Hank called out as he grimaced. He felt a sense of relief when they entered the ER. There was only one other person in the lobby, which he figured would assure him a short wait time. But as fate would have it, business was about to pick up. "My mother's having a heart attack," a woman blurted out as she wheeled her frail elderly mother through the entrance. She parked her mother's wheelchair a few seats down from where Hank and Rebecca sat, then went to check in with the receptionist. As Hank glanced over at the old woman, he could see her going in and out of consciousness. He looked over at the receptionist, but she was preoccupied and the security guard had stepped away. He called out to the woman. Ma'am, are you all right?" She suddenly went limp and slumped over in her chair. Hank painfully rose to his feet and limped towards her. "This woman needs assistance," he called out. He had never done CPR on someone in a wheelchair before, so he unbuckled her seatbelt, which caused her to fall out of her chair and land on the floor. The woman's daughter turned towards the commotion. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed as she rushed towards her mother. "What are you doing? She has osteoporosis. She could have broken a bone." Hank backed away apologetically as he motioned with his hands. "I'm sorry. It looked like she may have needed CPR." "Security, we need some help in here," the woman cried out. She turned back to Hank. "I'm a nurse, and you don't just yank someone out of a wheelchair like that." She crouched down next to her mother. Mom, are you all right?" "You want me to try and help get her back up?" "Just get away." "Ma'am, my husband was just trying to help her," Rebecca said as she interjected. "Help her? He may have broken her hip." The old woman's eyes suddenly opened and she began groaning as she rolled around on the floor. "Sorry to hear about the chaos in the waiting room earlier," the doctor in the ER said. "Is that lady okay?" Hank replied. The doctor nodded. I'm sure she'll be fine. He looked down at Hank's leg. Looks like you had a bit of a close call. That sting on your leg was heading towards a serious infection. A strong course of antibiotics should hopefully clear it up, though. Rebecca sighed with relief. Now, we're going to send you home in a wheelchair, and that'll assist you until your leg heals up and you're able to walk on it again. Hank spent the rest of the day bitterly staring out the window into his backyard. That evening, he struggled to wheel his chair across the rocks as he turned on the hose to water some plants. He gazed at the water as it filled the earth dam around his daisies. He reflected on the events of the last week. Kenny's castration, the rancher that was on the news, pleading to the public with fear in his eyes, his trip to the hospital, and dumping the old woman out of her wheelchair onto the waiting room floor. The sky bled orange and red as the sun set on the horizon. The earth dam began overflowing as Hank stared off into the distance, plotting his revenge. He made up his mind that he would retaliate when his wife went to visit their son in Lakewood over the weekend. After Rebecca pulled out of the driveway on Saturday morning, he sprang into action. He wheeled himself up to the edge of the steps that led to the basement. He then pulled himself to his feet and began feebly limping down the stairs. Hank collected military memorabilia and had amassed an impressive arsenal over the years. There were decorations and insignias that hung on the walls. Behind some clutter was a trapdoor that led into his armory. It creaked as he opened it. He pulled a dusty tarp off an array of military-grade weapons. There was an M4 carbine, grenades, and his most prized possession, a Vietnam-era flamethrower that he affectionately nicknamed Satan's Arbitrator. He picked it up and gazed at it nostalgically. He stood in front of the mirror now, dressed in his old military fatigues. He began applying some war paint to his face as Fortunate Son by CCR played through the speakers of his 1970s Sony stereo. He strapped the flamethrower to his back and then suddenly climbed the steps back to the upstairs. He wheeled himself outside, but the world felt suddenly unsafe. He looked up at the sky as he began to hear warplanes flying overhead and bombs exploding off in the distance. He was having a flashback. As he made his way around the side of the house, he could hear the laughter of the neighborhood children as they played together. He glanced over at them and began to see the faces of Vietnamese villagers. Hank parked his wheelchair several yards away from the ant piles, then lit up a cigarette. M2 flamethrower. Burns for 7 seconds and has a firing range of up to 45 yards. See, these are the kinds of weapons that us at the top of the food chain fight with, assholes. He then grinned and put on his geriatric sun visor. He pointed the flamethrower in the air and squeezed the trigger. An explosive burst of fire shot out the nozzle, which caused him to chuckle with amusement. Easy now. Old Hank's been known to be trigger happy. He lowered the barrel as the carefree smile wiped off his face. He then carefully took aim at the first colony. I'm gonna enjoy this. A large flame erupted out the end, charring the earth. The gas can that Hank was forced to abandon exploded into a ball of fire, ravaging the insects like a nuclear bomb. Many were killed instantly, vaporized on contact, while others were simply melted onto the rocks. The few that managed to survive were left crippled and disfigured. Hank paused and removed his visor as he assessed the devastation. A trail of smoke drifted from the flamethrower's nozzle as it cooled. Much of the ant's infrastructure, along with his backyard, was now destroyed. Suddenly, he spotted a small grass fire that had started at the edge of his property. "Shit!" he hissed. He began frantically wheeling himself towards the water spigot. Before he could reach it, however, his fence had caught on fire. Sirens rang out as police and firefighters arrived on the scene a short time later. The small grass fire had now turned into a raging inferno. Hank had snapped out of his flashback and watched from the street in horror as firemen fought to put out the blaze. It had already burned up his backyard and now spread to his neighbor's property, catching her house on fire. "Oh my God, what have I done?" he said to himself as he took off his flamethrower and sat it on the ground. He shouted towards Officers Ditmore and Castillo, who exited their vehicle. "Please tell me she wasn't in that house." Both officers began walking in his direction. Ditmore spoke into his mic as he answered radio traffic. "Dispatch, this is 4R7. Be advised, we've arrived on scene. We have a structure fire in progress." Hank threw his arms in the air. "I'm so glad you're finally here. Please tell me Mary wasn't inside there," he pleaded. "Are you the owner of this property?" Ditmore asked as he motioned to Hank's house. "Yeah, I was killing ants with my flamethrower and the fence caught on fire." Hank sighed as he tried to hold it together. "I tried to put it out, but I was too late." Ditmore typed on his phone as he took notes. "Okay, I'm Officer Ditmore, and this is my partner, Officer Castillo. Luckily, it sounds like your neighbor wasn't home at the time of the fire." "Oh, thank God," Hank said as he placed his hand over his forehead with relief. After the fire was contained and he finished answering questions, Hank picked up his flamethrower and wheeled himself back inside his home. He sat it down next to the front door and went into the bathroom. He washed the paint off his face and wondered to himself how he was going to explain things to Rebecca. You really did it now, Hank," he said to himself as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. He poured himself a shot of brandy and turned on the television. Several drinks later, his eyelids grew heavy as he began to doze off. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, one of the mutated ants crawled out from beneath a baseboard. It surveyed the living room and got a visual on Hank, who lies snoring in his chair. Moments later, following its signal, tens of thousands of the ants deployed and began boring through the wood. They soon spilled out through the opening, leaving behind a pile of wood shavings as they stormed the living room. They savagely tore a fly carcass limb from limb as they advanced towards Hank in what only could be described as a pilgrimage of punishment. He was alone and surrounded. They swarmed his chair, covering his body and crawling into every crevice of his uniform. He instinctively brushed at his face and was soon awoken by the creeping, unsettling feeling of their tiny feet moving across his skin. Once in position, they launched a coordinated attack, and Hank felt the unholy wrath of the tiny man-made killing machines. He was jolted to his feet, and he began slapping at his body as he screamed in agony. The pain was nearly unbearable and increasing in intensity by the second. He tipped over the end table, sending the bottle of brandy shattering on the floor. He staggered into the bedroom, coughing up ants as he desperately peeled off his uniform. He stripped down to his underwear, gazing into the mirror with horror. He stumbled towards the shower, tripping over his own feet and crashing through its glass door. The ants' military might proved insurmountable. More territory was conquered, and Hank was cut down in a crushing defeat. Rebecca pulled into their driveway the next afternoon. "I'm home," she called out as she entered through the pantry. She took off her sunglasses and sat her purse down on the washing machine. She noticed an ant crawling up the wall. She smashed it with her hand. "We really need to get the health department out here to take care of these ants." She sniffed the air. "Why does it smell like smoke in here?" she said to herself curiously. She held a ceramic coffee cup in her hand with the caption, "World's Best Grandpa" on it. "Wait till you see what the kids got you," she said with a grin. She rounded the corner into the living room and seen the tipped-over end table and broken bottle on the ground. Her face twisted with concern. "Hank!" she shouted as she began to panic. "Hank!" her voice cried out as she began to search the house. She entered the bedroom and seen his uniform crumpled up on the ground. Another episode, she thought to herself. When she entered the bathroom, however, she quickly realized it was something much grislier than that. She seen the broken glass and Hank's corpse sprawled out on the ground inside the shower, his bones stripped clean of all the tissue. She dropped the mug, causing it to shatter on the ground. She then placed her hand over her mouth as it began to tremble. Her blood-curdling screams echoed through the house as she processed the nightmare that she bore witness to. All the while, 1,000 tiny eyes watched her and waited. hope you enjoyed tonight's story, The War by Bryan Asbury. Bryan Asbury is originally from Pueblo, Colorado. He's a big fan of television shows like Tales from the Crypt and The Twilight Zone. He also enjoys gritty 90s psychological thrillers like Cape Fear and Unlawful Entry. He's a regular contributor for Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, True Blood's Dark Tales in particular, and if you enjoyed this story, you can check out many of his other ones available on the network. He recently signed with the Evil Cookie Publishing, who just released his latest book, Waking the Dead. It features 8 short stories, one of which is currently being adapted into a movie. You can order your copy on theevilcookie.com, Amazon, or barnesandnoble.com. It also recently became available on Audible, performed by Drew Blood, Geoff Sturtevant, and Otis Jiry, all of whom can be found on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Fans can connect with him on Facebook under Bryan Asbury, writer. He'd like to thank his lovely wife, Amber, who has been one of his biggest inspirations, and also all his family and friends. You know who you are. Thanks, Bryan. If you enjoyed tonight's story, hosted by yours truly, Paul J. McSorley, you can search my name on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube for additional previous stories. If you'd like to hear more lengthy tales, be sure to take a look at my audiobooks. Available now on audible.com or just visit paulsbooks.net. That's PAULSBOOKS.net. You can also find me personally on Facebook and Twitter. And with that, listeners, our weekly journey into the psyche has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for tonight's episode and remind you to take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you haven't already. And while you're at it, please remember to stop by our Apple Podcast page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and subscribe. The charts are based on subscriptions, not listens. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate it. I'm your host for Fear from the Heartland, Paul J. McSorley. I've enjoyed the titillation tonight. Ooh, there's that word again. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again next week at Fear from the Heartland.